Okay, welcome to everyone to the inaugural. You are all in on the ground floor. You know, this is if I were making some kind of pitch to you to buy a condo in Florida or something. You're all here for the very first of a series of 3 talks this summer, which we're calling Understanding the World. This is a collaboration between the University of Toledo, specifically the Judith College of Arts, Social Sciences, and Education, which is a very long acronym, otherwise known as JHCASE, and the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library, where we're very happy to be able to hold this talk today. So we're glad to see all of you here. My name is Dr. Barry Jackish. I'm a faculty member in the history department at the University of Toledo. And I just want to introduce very briefly this series and make you aware of a few people involved, and then the upcoming talks, the other 2 talks that are going to take place later this summer. So I would like to just very quickly thank a couple of people here from the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library, Allison Fiskus, almost as if we worked out the timing on that. Allison Fiskus and Zach Huber, who's sitting in back, for all of their help on this side for coordinating the speaker series. I'd also like to give a nod to my colleague at the University of Toledo in the Political Science Department, Professor Joel Voss, who could not be here today, but is a co-creator and director with me of this series. And he will also be the speaker for our second talk, which is taking place next month, July 23rd. So please make sure to mark that on your calendar. And I'd like to also thank the previously mentioned JHCASE, our college at the University of Toledo, colleagues who are in the dean's office there for their support, and specifically Dean Melissa Gregory. So with those sort of housekeeping things out of the way, I want to remind you of 2 more talks that are coming in this series. As you all should know, today is Africa and the US in a world with shared power. So I'm going to clear out and let that happen very quickly here. Our next 2 talks, and I believe there are flyers that are over there. If you don't have one yet, there are flyers over there on the table that you can feel free to get some further information. Thursday, they're all on Thursday. They're all in this room from 3 to 5 p.m. So there's consistency there. So the next one is July 23rd. That is a talk entitled International Law and War, again from Professor Joel Voss in the Political Science Department. And then in August 13th, How the Ukraine War is Reshaping Europe and NATO. And that talk will be given by yours truly. So we are a small but hopefully effective group. So that's enough for me. Again, thank you all for being here. It's great to see this partnership develop, and we're looking forward to many more opportunities. And now I would like to turn it over to Professor Shingi Mavima, also from the Department of History, to introduce today's speaker. So, yep. What's that? Oh, I knew it was going to happen. See, I told you I'd walk away with the mic.
Good afternoon, folks. It's my great pleasure to be here. Just coming in from Chicago this morning, so really excited to be here. So today, you guys will be familiar with the topic that our speaker will be speaking on today. And I think it's very timely. You know, I think we are encountering a very interesting time for Africa in global geopolitics, right? Culturally, we've seen the rise of what we call an Afropolitan culture, which is the sort of a portmanteau between African and cosmopolitan, right? Which is, for a long time, things of Africa, even when you spoke about them within the context of the globe, it was almost always on the periphery or as objects of history as opposed to being subjects. But we've been seeing the rise of whether it's Afro beats as popular music, or certain voices in media that you know, these moments, these texts and philosophies that are arising from Africa that are gaining global notoriety and not as some sort of this exotic thing that happens over there. Indeed. So there is that. Then you see very real tangible things, right? You've seen initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. That's something that folks are pushing towards, which would make all of Africa and its 1.5 billion people sort of operate as this unity, as this free trade pushes within the African Union for even a permanent seat for African representation on the UN. So you have these several moments of this nature that are happening that make it a very fascinating time to see where this is going. Without further ado, I would. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who happens to be one of our PhD students in the history department, the University of Toledo, a student that I get to work closely with, who also comes to us from a background in policy work, right? Before they made their way to the PhD program here, so he also comes very informed from that world, as well as somebody who has many different community building things, initiatives happening within Botswana in particular, but Southern Africa in general. So without further ado, please allow me to welcome Mr. Boitsoko Molefe, who will be our speaker today. Indeed. Let's hear it for the boy.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Boitsoko Molefe. I'm a PhD student in the history department. My major field is African history. My minor field is modern Europe, particularly 20th century Europe. And today's talk, Africa and the US in a world with shared power, is apropos for many reasons. I think one, the conversation in political science spaces and in policy spaces around multipolarity and how the world is experiencing these multiple spheres of influence, as people would say, has been a very salient conversation. And people seeing how the US with America First has almost begun to take a backseat in global politics. Europe is having its issues with its former colonies in the African continent and more broadly. And you see this rise and resurgence of this Pan-Africanist spirit in a lot of African places that are trying to assert themselves in this reorienting space that we call the international order. So in my talk today, I want to get into those conversations and really unpack not only what is happening from the perspective of an African vantage point, but things that America should think about or Americans can think about when it comes to the implications of Africa and US relations. All right. So as a brief overview, the African continent and the United States relations are at a critical juncture with multipolarity dynamics tilting in favor of non-Western nations and the decline of Western hard and soft power in an exceedingly polarized global order. Through bilateral and multilateral agreements, consolidation of economic and political interests is vastly expanding while consequently displacing U.S. positionality on the continent. While regional and continental cooperation frameworks exist, individual national interests imperatively inform the political and economic outcomes of the broader U.S. foreign policy strategy and corporate interests. So what we're beginning to see more tangibly now is that as African countries are not only acting as individual actors, but also within not only economic but political blocs, it is creating this very unique positionality for the United States, where the US has to begin to think about how is my relationship, for example, with Ghana, going to intersect with my relationship with Libya or with South Africa or with Kenya? And ultimately, what does that mean for, let's say, the business interests of an American company that's operating in these spaces or trying to operate in these spaces, given the geopolitical nature of business currently in the United States? So there are these interwoven dynamics that are happening simultaneously that are not only being pushed by Africa, but also pulled by America. And this is creating an environment in many ways where there are opportunities for things to go really well and for things to go not so really well. And I'll give a brief historical context of how I essentially envisage multipolarity as defined within a contemporary context. Although I argue in my work that multipolarity is not a recent phenomenon, but more so has existed, at least formally, structurally, since the Berlin Conference of 1884, which predicates, or at least precipitates, what we call the Scramble of Africa and the imperial projects across not only Africa, but Asia and other parts of the world, and the Americas, more saliently. So, to give a historical context, this is how I envisage the historical waves of multipolar dynamics. So one of the kind of formative spaces that creates these multipolar dynamics, I would argue the transatlantic slave trade, which creates not only these interactions between the African continent and the Americas, but also Europe, as European nation states, European corporations are integrally involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And so there is positionality that both American interests and European interests are curating in these spaces to build influence, to build points of leverage, to even build economic opportunity. And then the second wave, I would argue, is the post-emancipation, at least 1863, in the context of the United States. But we know that as early as 1832, for example, in the Danish East Indies, you have the liberation of enslaved people as a reaction to the Haitian Revolution that happens early in the 1800s. So some parts of the America have begun the emancipation of enslaved people. The U.S. is really on the back burner in many ways of the emancipation of enslaved people. But what that intersects with within a global context is the movement in many ways of formerly enslaved people or born free people in the Caribbean who are interacting with this American space that has enslaved people, but is also contending within the Reconstruction phase with the reality of what happens to enslaved people, but also more broadly, how these people begin to interface with the world. We see through the American Colonization Society, the formation of Liberia. And Liberia becomes the signpost on the African continent of American imperialism in many ways, where the Americo-Liberians essentially recolonize Liberia, and that precipitates later down in the 1950s and 60s into the civil war that breaks out in Liberia. So we see that this post-emancipation to pre-Cold War period, again with World War I, World War II becoming these melting pots in many ways of Africans coming into Europe or going to the Middle East to serve in different capacities, creates these points of intersection that are embedded within the contestation of European powers. The very idea that World War I or World War II, couched as a world war and narratively described within the interest of Europeans, pretty much unpacks this idea of a multipolar context. And of course, the Cold War, we have the East, the Western blocs, and the emergence of the non-aligned movement that creates what's called the third way, or an alternative way that isn't couched within the interests of Western political ideology or Eastern political ideology, with the undercurrent in many ways that the Soviet Union and China, in building their alliances during the Cold War, are essentially cultivating relationships based off of shared experiences, particularly China, which was a former colony is able to build alliances and rapport with African countries pushing for decolonization during the Cold War, right? And an integral part of the conflict is that as the European presence is declining on the African continent in many different ways, America is in some instances supporting the propagation of European influence, which is counter what the Africans want, which has real life ramifications post decolonization, as we will get into. And then post Cold War to what's called the BRICS, or Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is this, what we call the global South response to the G8. And this idea that the global South has to, in many ways, curate a space where they have economic and some sort of political agency that can counter Western interests in many different ways. And so as the Soviet Union collapses and Russia, or the nation of Russia, emerges in this rebranded, some people would argue, Soviet outfit, they begin to cultivate these colonial relationships, or the decolonization relationships between themselves and these new African states in ways that are leveraged to empower this idea of a resurgence of African self-determination in many different ways. And then the post-BRICS multipolarity dynamics that, again, are taking form within the consolidation of what we call regional economic blocs, so ECOWAS in West Africa, SADC in Southern Africa, and the economic bloc in North Africa and East Africa as well. So you have these consolidations of regional power that are happening, but also the permeation of China and Russia becoming very much involved in not only supporting developmentally, but foreign aid-wise and militarily in a lot of African spaces, which is also systematically pushing out the United States and pushing out other European countries. Then the key themes that I want to key on, at least as the points of our discussion, would be the idea of the spheres of influence, African self-assertion, and American isolation as these converging factors that create what we see as the articulation of the current dynamics between America and Africa. And so what we begin to see, as I spoke about BRICS earlier, is that these alternative global partners that are evolving. One, you have, again, Russia emerging, you have China consolidating its power, and now in the 2020s, you have the Middle East through the GCC, which I'll talk about later on, that are emerging as critical players within the African continent, both targeting political salience within this region, but also economic gain. So Africa being rich with minerals and mineral wealth, and having essentially one of the youngest populations in the world, as a place for new markets, as a place for even sourcing out some of the best talent, sourcing out some of the spaces in which you're testing new technologies on all these different things, which separate issue for another talk. But you are seeing this renewed scramble for Africa, as we would call it, in that way. The second is African self-assertion. Dr. Mavima has alluded to the idea of African nations pushing for more influence within the United Nations. One of the big conversations that emerges in the 2010s and has gained traction across smaller states within the United Nations, and a very robust voice from the African bloc, has been the notion that Africa, as 54 countries, cannot have 2 representatives in the Security Council and not have a permanent member vote. That permanent member votes have been reserved historically for countries that today still leverage those not only for political, but economic, strategic points. So that has gained a lot of traction and culminated in a lot of different discourse around whether Africa sees value in the United Nations as an organization, and to what extent Africa can and should participate in the United Nations. in that regard. Then the last and more recent element is the American self-isolation. So America's withdrawal from international affairs, we can see with the idea of America First that emerges, post the 2024 election, cultivating a very tense environment that has also consequently advanced the interests of both Russia, China, and the Middle East within the African continent. So the idea of new spheres of influence is really, or at least I unpack it from two vantage points. One vantage point being multilateral agreements, and the second vantage point being bilateral agreements and their intersections in how this formatively curates U.S. and Africa dynamics. So from a multilateral agreement perspective, you have the Forum on China and African Cooperation that is facilitated through the organs such as the African Union, which is fundamentally strategically being used by China to not only leverage opportunity economically and politically within the African context, but it's also a way in which China has been strategically successful in recruiting intellectual talent from Africa in many different ways. So through scholarship programs and then through job opportunities in ways in which it's borrowing from an American model that has largely benefited from America's policy on immigration, at least in the past, where some of the best talent in the world has been effective contributors to the economic growth and development of the United States. So China is angling in many different ways using American strategies that have led to success in ways in which to advance its own position as the U.S. retreats. Secondly, it's the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa BRICS, which South Africa joined in 2011, and South Africa being the largest economy on the continent, taking that lead and positioning itself within BRICS has opened the door for other African countries. And in as recently as 2024, 10 new members have joined BRICS from within the African continent, which is creating a far more robust economic nexus outside of the traditional nexus controlled by Europe. And as we see in many different ways, as African countries are positioning themselves for alternative markets that in many ways could be argued are apolitical. So China, who really doesn't care too much about your political ideology if they're giving you foreign aid or if they're giving you developmental aid, right? That those type of opportunities are becoming far more, interesting for African countries. Additionally, the process of acquiring these funds matters, right? Whereas the IMF and the World Bank might take years to approve a loan that then may be affected by inflation and all these different things, China has been very quick with dispensing aid and dispensing developmental financing. And that has been a huge handicap in how the U.S. has been able to position itself. And so these multilateral agreements that are either channeled through the African Union or through regional blocs such as SADC or ECOWAS are being used by China in many different ways to position itself not only as a political ally, an economic supporter, but also as a strategic partner in the development and cultivation of influence around the world. And as I said, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is an emerging force from the Middle East, that for those who are familiar with the war in Ethiopia currently, or the conflicts in Somaliland and Sudan, right? A part of who's in that mix is the UAE, Saudi Arabia, are integral players in that, in supporting different parts of that conflict. So some of the vying for influence is playing out through proxy conflicts in different parts of the world. And so these multilateral agreements are vehicles in which these alternative bases and nexus of power are able to find space and opportunity to operate in Africa to the detriment of the United States. The second is the bilateral agreements, which I've categorized into four main areas. So the Belt and Road Initiative, which is developed by China. Over here, we can see a map of the African continent and countries that have essentially joined this Belt and Road Initiative, and therefore have been receiving a lot of developmental aid and foreign aid from China. And as you can see, it's about 40 countries currently out of the 55 are a part of this initiative, which means that in many different ways, the United States is, at least in some respects, losing influence or has lost influence in significant countries that are strategic. So you look at South Africa, which has been a member from a very long time, particularly owing to BRICS. You think about the North African countries, you think about the mineral-rich countries as well, and what their critical role becomes in being a part of this Belt and Road Initiative. So what are they getting from China? What is China getting from them? Right? What are they getting from Russia, and what is Russia giving to them? Right? In the Sahel region, particularly Mali, Niger, we've seen military aid come in as the French have been pushed out by those governments, owing primarily, again, to this idea of we do not trust America for a plethora of reasons, whether it's America had roles in the different parts of their history. For example, with the DRC, we know that with Patrice Lumumba's assassination, the CIA was involved in that. And so some of these historical wounds are still salient in many different ways and are causing, for all intents and purposes, opportunity for other actors to come in. And finally, as I said, foreign aid and developmental funding. This becomes important as China is able to specifically target countries it knows are important to its strategic leverage, right? So America has historically been present in Africa through building military bases in different parts of the country, right? For instance, there is a military base in Djibouti. What China did was they gave Djibouti a developmental fund to build a port, with the understanding that if Djibouti couldn't pay, then China would take over the port. And if China controls a port in Djibouti where America is, that makes for interesting geopolitics, right? And how China and the US can wield influence in these different spaces, right? So these are some of the things that come to play. And when you combine the bilateral with a multilateral, it creates a space in which either divide and rule can come into play, or this idea of by piecemeal building these alliances in ways that undercut American interests. Because a lot of, just like America thinks of America first as a thing, a lot of African countries trying to assert their positionality in the world will think of themselves first, which may not include, hey, we have this friend called the United States. So the second part of it is African self-assertion. As Dr. Mavima also alluded to, the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is a map of that free trade area, what it looks like. And the strategy behind the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is to be able to connect African resources from primary production spaces to tertiary production spaces. So instead of having goods, or at least raw materials, exported to other parts of the world, they can be moved to different parts of Africa to be processed. Currently in Nigeria, one of the biggest oil refineries has been built there. And the goal with the African Continental Free Trade Area is to facilitate a lot of oil refinement in Nigeria. And had that prior to the Operation Epic Fury, prior to that, had the oil refinery been in full swing, Africa might not have been affected as much by what was happening in the Strait of Hormuz and with oil. So a lot of these initiatives, particularly concerning the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, are set up in ways in which Africa is trying to find ways outside of dependency from external, not only supply influences, but demand influences, but also economic ups and downs that they have no control over. Secondly, as I referred to the Sahel region with the expulsion of the Western critical role. So In former Francophone countries, the French colonies, a lot of them have dispelled the French as military advisors, as developmental advisors, and have brought in different partners. So they brought in the Chinese, they brought in the Russians, some are bringing in the Middle Eastern countries to give not only advice, but also technical support in these areas. And what that is doing is that even if America does not have a presence, for example, let's say in Mali, but by virtue of the French being there, or the British being there, or the Italians being there, or whoever European being there, who is an ally by proximity, that allowed America a sense of agency and operability within that space. And so as the West is being dispelled in these critical roles across the continent, that is creating opportunities for other actors to come in, and that creates a buffer and a distance for the U.S. to actively assert itself and even pursue its own interests in that area. And the other part of this is the exertion of projection of power. So you have the crisis in Haiti that's currently happening. And part of the response, at least the proposed response to that, was that Kenya would lead the mission and the operation to reestablish a government in Haiti. So an integral part of projecting, power and influence has been to show Africa's capability of intervening or through some sort of military or technical assistance. And so this self-determination, whether through building new alliances or within the internal metrics of Africa, building infrastructure and programming or initiatives that are consolidating African power, are integral in ultimately pushing forward this either strained or possibly potentially, mutually beneficial relationship between Africa and the United States. And then lastly, the American self-isolation. So one of the things that we've noticed of recent is the, again, decline of the salience of hard and soft power in the United States. 5 major issues that I want to at least focus on is one, what happens in 2011, although I couched it within the idea of BRICS, what happens in 2011 as well is the beginning of what's called the Arab Spring Popular League, which is this chain reaction of countries within the North African region beginning to push for democracy and these revolutions and revolts that starts off in Tunisia, right? And then cascades to different parts of Africa. Libya becomes a casualty of that. And what that Arab Spring consequently also creates is this instability in the Sahel region, where you have formerly strong men or autocrats or dictators who had a grip on power, at least some modicum of stability there. The pursuit of democracy that didn't have the institutions to support it fundamentally created an instability where radical elements begin to emerge, right? And the US's presence militarily or otherwise technically from a soft power, foreign aid, or even developmental aid has not necessarily yielded the desired results, at least in many people's eyes. And so therefore that has caused a shift in how people perceive the US's ability to be a problem solver in many different ways. Again, the caveat here being that American assistance is often couched within certain political, ideological understandings, which oftentimes may not be what people may want to co-sign in their pursuit of developing their region. So that becomes a bit of a rubbing point. The second one that I want to focus on is the COVID-19 pandemic, that again, you have this supply chain breakdown around vaccines getting to different parts of the world, where historically the US had been the proactive supporter of health initiatives. We can go as far back as thinking about the HIV/AIDS pandemic when it takes hold over the world, and how America was very involved in that response. And to see that retraction in many different ways, kind of raised eyebrows, because China jumps into the fray with their Sino vaccine and begins to actively engage with different parts of the world to lend support. And that missed opportunity begins a cascade, as we see in the 2020s, in many different ways. In 24, post-election, we see the USAID withdrawals across the continent that, again, upend some programs that are critical in many ways for peace and security in some parts of Africa. And that also immediately receives a response from China or Russia who say, hey, we know the Americans are not here anymore, we can provide support. And that, again, isolationism from the United States and the lack of soft power use creates a vacuum that other people are more than willing to step in because they are trying to assert themselves within this, global hegemony, so to speak. The U.S. has changed in the UN as, decided to say, hey, we want to withdraw our financial support, or even just how we wield our power within the UN has also had detrimental effects and allowing other people to step in. And then violations of what we conceive as international law, with what we saw with absolute resolve in Venezuela, with Maduro's, with the deposing of Maduro, and then with Epic Fury as well, and what that's kind of cascaded into currently, that these don't bode well for a country that, although has had somewhat of a checkered past in how it's played its diplomatic role, these, for a lot of people in the contemporary sense, are a step too far to say if America can just, with impunity say, hey, we're going to come in and, install a new person. And we don't like them, we're going to put another person. If we don't like them, we're going to put another person. Like, that type of rhetoric doesn't bode well in trying to build healthy relationships, particularly with countries that are former colonies, right? That are in many ways still building up from the dependencies that are systemically built into the legacies of decolonization. And so I guess the question then is the U.S. still a desirable partner, and how well does the U.S. fare as a partner for Africa? My answer to this, and I leave it also up to, to the audience to think about it. I think my answer to this is the U.S. has opportunities in many different ways. One of the benefits of the U.S.'s 250 years, as we're now celebrating that anniversary, one of the benefits of that 250-year history as a nation is that there is at least countless examples that point to ways in which the U.S. can be a force for good, both as a development partner, from a military expertise perspective, from a social development perspective. There are opportunities for the U.S. to engage. However, the United States has to maybe reflect on what does engagement look like. Do we stick to engagement on our terms exclusively, or do we begin to see the world maybe from a perspective where people have different cultures, people have different things that they believe in or that they value? So what maybe America might prioritize may not be a priority for a different country, right? For a country to say, hey, we may not necessarily want to build 15, 20 universities. We maybe just want healthcare first, right? So part of that is, I think the United States has to reflect on what it truly sees, not only its role is in the world, but also what that role looks like in a global culture that is not monolithic, that is dynamic, that is also interacting in ways that's ebbing and flowing and shaping each other. And so if America answers that to say, hey, we may not want to be a desirable partner anymore, which is perfectly fine, that is still that's still a viable option. But if America decides, hey, we want to be a partner for Africa and work within African continents and spaces, then there's a conversation that needs to be had to say, these 55 countries within the African continent, do we deal with them all the same way? What is our plan if we're engaging? And ultimately, do we even want to deal with all of them? And I think whatever that answer looks like is up to not only the American people, but the American government. And with that, I conclude my talk and open for questions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
You made a very interesting point about the memory of something like the Patrice Lumumba affair sticking in the minds of people. But with that put aside, what kind of things did the United States do wrong that up until the Trump administration? I mean, before there was an openly hostile Make America Great Again
Yeah.
kind of political atmosphere. Before that, what kind of things didn't America do right? That was you alluded to this, but you
Yes.
didn't give any specific examples.
Examples. All right.
What could we have done between 1960 and 2016 or 2019 when they didn't give the COVID vaccines?
Yeah. So, since we're going back to the 60s, I'll just go to 1970, for example. So when you have, in many cases, there are countless motions that were filed with the United Nations Security Council where sanctions have been proposed against the apartheid regime, for example, the Rhodesian regime, or, where sanctions were posed, but, for example, Reagan was like, hey, we're still gonna buy this cobalt from Rhodesia. We're still going to interact with these different countries, again, under the guise of, anti-communism, right? Or at least the communism scared, right? And for a lot of places that were saying, hey, the reason why we're even talking to the Soviets or the Chinese is because you're supporting these other guys, right? So there's that dimension. And then when we fast forward to the 2000s, with the different incursions that are happening in the African continent, right? Libya, like I cited Libya, for example, with the US backing the rebels without looking into what happens after Gaddafi falls, right? What do we do to create a space where you can build legitimate governments? Immediately following Gaddafi, you have the Libyan civil war, right? Where you have different, factions fighting for that, right? We fast forward into, I think, some of the later Obama years as well, when you think about what happens in Somalia, in that part of the world, where there's a priority on these extremist groups, right? At least to say, hey, we will deal with who's dealing with extremist groups, regardless of their politics, right? It's this idea of a lesser evil in a ways in which supports regimes that otherwise may not necessarily be in the best interest of people, right? So the one more example that I want to give is that when we look at the COVID-19 situation more specifically, right? That it took, because I moved back to Botswana right during COVID. So in May 2020, I moved back, and one of the issues that we discussed, again, my other background is microbiology. So one of the issues that we discussed was that America was sending vaccines to African countries that Americans were not taking. So when the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was banned in the United States, that was being shipped to African countries, right? So people then raised the question, hey, if Americans can't take it or are not allowed to take it, why is this being donated to us if it's not safe for your own people, right? So that for many people, right? Because in China, Sinovac was the vaccine that was being used. So it's like, well, if the Chinese are taking it, we'll take it, right? But when you have an instance that profound where this vaccine that's been pulled off the American shelves is being donated to us, right? That becomes a problem, right, for many different people. So that was one glaring one, in a very contemporary sense.
Okay, that is a very good answer to the. I knew about the political situation
Yes.
with vetoes and so on from one of the seminars with Professor Mavima, but I didn't think of some of these. Like I never knew that the Johnson & Johnson one was the one that was distributed.
That was distributed, and that was the one that was donated. Of course, later on, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were able to make it once America had satisfied its own supply chain needs.
Right.
But the first donations were, hey, have this Johnson & Johnson vaccine, right? and that was, for a lot of medical practitioners, they were like, well, we don't understand why this is happening. But because of the crisis and the urgency of COVID, people were just forced to take what they could get.
And there were other kind of insensitive things that took place all along in those decades.
Yes.
It just wasn't until the COVID.
Yeah, the COVID, I think, was one where in a moment of crisis where, again, there's historical precedence that the U.S. has been very forthcoming in how it's dealt with at least other developing parts of the world, in, I'd say, good faith, right? That this one moment was like, well, are we any lesser, in this way? So that became I think, in many different spaces, a very sore point for a lot of people. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a few. With regard to the BRICS,
Yes.
South Africa was obviously the smallest. The Chinese voice seemed very large.
Yes.
How has the expansion changed the dynamic?
That's a very good question. So to that point, again, when South Africa comes in, smallest economy, smallest voice, and part of the contention around membership expansion for BRICS has been China's own concern, and even Russia's own concern, and even India, the big economies are saying, hey, yeah, we might have to, it becomes this quagmire that the UN has, right, of the Security Council having these particular people able to make certain decisions because of just the weight of the economies or the weight of just their power, right? So BRICS is also wrestling with that now to say, as we're letting new people in, are the voices going to be equal? This idea that, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others, right? That has been a conversation that's going on with BRICS, and part of the delay with that, I think they had about 35 plus countries apply for membership, and that was suspended for a while as they were trying to figure out what the new modalities would look like now that you're having more people join the fray, not necessarily economies of the same size or magnitude. And so how do you negotiate that for an organization that is built around economic interests and not necessarily political, ambition? I hope that answers the question.
Okay, the second question would be on China's assistance
Yes.
and its impact. Do you have any data on the percentage of that is loan debt-based rather than donation-based?
Currently, I don't have the numbers, but from a general perspective, the loan debt based is far more disproportionate, right, than the aid based. So a lot of discourse has come up that a lot of the Chinese funding is in some ways predatory, and although it's convenient to access, there are issues around how China maybe structures some of these contracts, how African countries maybe are being lulled into this sustained dependency. So those are some of the conversations that are happening around that. But China leverages this idea that their aid is apolitical, right? That you coming to them saying, hey, I need money for this, and they are not going to ask any questions about what regime you run, what type of government you run. For them, it's a financial decision that, of course, has long-term strategic goals, but they are not necessarily tied to a political ideology as kind of being front-facing in who they give money to or how they give money. Yes. Dr. Jackish.
So thanks for the presentation. This is really interesting, and I think we don't generally talk about these issues enough at all. And so you talked about hard power, military aid, and soft power. Without wading into what seems to be our current policy right now, which is to sort of shed or seriously diminish the U.S. and its ability to, or its desire to continue to fund soft power in Africa, but elsewhere in the world. We're talking about, in the grand scheme of things, relatively small amounts of money that have a substantial effect. And in spite of that, we walked away from it, okay? In many cases, not everywhere, but in many cases. I just saw where we had fully backed away from ongoing AIDS treatment, for example.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you kind of posited China and Russia. And I think sometimes there's the public perception that the US is completely walking away and China and Russia are stepping in, which is happening. But I'm interested in the African, kind of similar to this, and I don't want to generalize, Africa, but we're talking broadly. What are some examples of how countries think about the pitch that China's making? I mean, these are savvy politicians who understand that not everything China is telling them may necessarily turn out to be the case.
Yeah.
We've seen really horrible human rights abuses with Russia's Wagner group, for example, in parts of Africa, where in some countries they're coming in and basically training the military or paramilitary forces of authoritarians or dictators. So there's a bit of a mixed bag with all of that too. And I just wonder, what is the perception like from some of the countries that you're most familiar with about what we might call large power interests in Africa right now?
Yes. So to answer that question, just to step it back into a historical context of one of the things that, again, happens within the continent, right? So I think by 1972, you had over 28 coups d'etats across multiple countries, some countries having successive coups d'etats, right, that have Europe's fingerprints and America's fingerprints on, right? So given that historical context of the West's very engaged hand in the machinations of African politics, what has become a very, I think, pragmatic perspective for some people is that, to the point of dictators, might is right. So I'm going to ensure my, interests, the people be damned, right? So there's that perspective of people who are saying, look, I'm going to do what I'm going to do to make sure that I'm either president for life or dictator for life, or at least benefiting myself, right? However, there's also this side within African context where governments are making decisions based off of their economic situation. I can't wait 10 years for the IMF or the World Bank to approve a loan. I want to build a road, I want to build schools, I want to invest in our healthcare infrastructure. And whoever gives me the money, even if the terms are not favorable, some governments are hedging the bets that we'll be able to build our economies and pay this money back, right? Or we'll be able to think about how to restructure these loans so we can pay it back, right? So there's the extreme of this is purely a pragmatic decision by someone who wants to control power. But there's this also very real reality in some countries that we don't have the ability to wait for this aid package that is politically motivated, right? We just want to do this thing. But if this person starts saying, hey, you need to have this infrastructure in place or that infrastructure in place, right? I think that Americans often take for granted that it took hundreds of years to build the American infrastructure, right? That it's only in 1965 that all Americans could vote, right? So that is at least 100, and 50 plus years of history before everybody could vote. And the youngest African country is probably in its late 70s. So we're comparing two different types of institutions. One institution that developed, the American institution, developed within itself without the impetus or the manipulation of other powers. And you're looking at spaces that have constantly been under the influence of other countries or the machinations of other countries, right? So Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, since he's staged his coup and taken over, he has had multiple coup attempts against his life. And although he is an authoritarian figure, the people of Burkina Faso are saying, hey, this is the best guy for the job right now, right? Because he's at least getting stuff done. Is it democratic? No, but is it what we need? Absolutely, right? Or we can, take it a step further and look at, so you have that type of reality where people are making very pragmatic decisions about their style of governance. Rwanda is another country that is, in many ways, and this is not talked about enough, but has an existential crisis of saying the Rwandan genocide takes place in '94, and currently in Rwanda there is silent and quiet panic about who becomes the next leader after Kagame leaves. Because we do not want to have the genocide happen again, but we don't know who is coming in who won't stoke those tensions. So some of these precarious situations of very young countries like have to be factored into the calculuses that they're making. So it's not a very flat, hey, China's coming in, Russia's coming in and being predatory, but there's some level of agency folks are exercising to find the best possible means to survive as countries. Yes, I hope I was able to.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Your talk reflected on the real opportunities for different forms of regional cooperation that exist in the current moment. Well, you may know I wrote about SADC from the Southern African Development Community from the 80s up through when I retired.
Yes.
And I was always hopeful in the opportunities that it presented to lessen differences among nation states.
Absolutely.
So the question I'd ask you is, how do you see the balance between the power of those 50 plus individual governments and their degree of commitment to working together regionally?
Yes.
Does the nation state tend, when push comes to shove, to override the regional impetus? Or has there been a sufficient change that regionalism now has a better chance than perhaps it did at an earlier stage?
Yes, I think in the earlier stages, again, within the fervor of nationhood formation, right, there was a real optimism about how regional organizations and even continental organizations could take shape, right? But as personalities, take precedence in certain parts of Africa, I mean, you can talk about your Idi Amins, you can talk about, we can go down the list, your Robert Mugabe's, all these people who become these personality leaders in many different ways. As those come to the fray, but also this, when you think about neocolonialism and what, Frantz Fanon, calls, black skin, white faces, right? That there is an inherited sense of imperialism and colonial conquest that's taken shape, right? So one of the issues in SADC, for example, is that South Africa wants to assert itself as the biggest voice. I mean, they are, for all intents and purposes, the biggest economy. And so they want to throw their weight around as, we're the big, we make this regional body work, right? Which in many ways then undercuts this idea of regional cooperation, regional integration, right? So even with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, one of the issues that's always come up is to say, hey, who benefits, who doesn't, right? In the grand scheme of how industries are developing, how economics works, and even just how the different opportunities are explored. So I think an integral part, and I think from the citizens of Africa's perspective, I think there's a very real desire to find some sort of balance in how we interact and integrate within the broader, continental context. But I think the not only inherited political institutions and infrastructure, but how the machinations of neocolonial influences play out in different parts of Africa, they stifle those. So in many ways, you have the Anglophone, which are the former British colonies kind of doing their thing. Then you have the Francophone people doing their thing. Then you have the Lusophone people doing their thing. And so even just those linguistic barriers and those cultural legacies of colonialism have, in many ways, created certain barriers that undercut the salience of at least state-driven regional integration.
So what are the prospects of that organization you showed, the economic cooperation that covered most of the continent?
Most of the continent. So I'd say, from a corporate perspective, businesses are taking advantage of it. As someone again who's been in the policy spaces since 2016 and has attended many conferences on the African continental free trade, one of the points of frustration that I've always had is to say that there's a lot of lip service to this idea of integrated economic systems, but governments are not intentionally creating policy infrastructure, both from the economic perspective, but also the foreign policy perspective, to facilitate some of these things to happen, right? Regions have tried, ECOWAS, I think, has gone the furthest, so the West African Economic Cooperation region, they've gone the furthest in creating, for example, a passport that they can all travel within the region. They have created, in many ways, these limited barriers of entry, these limited barriers of interaction, in many different ways. But for the African continental free trade, because again, it's coming into a space that already has these different geopolitical interests, and also state level interests, that becomes, I think, more of a problem at the state level. But I think from a corporate level, businesses are taking advantage of that. And hopefully, I'd say, with the machinations of the internet and the use of digital technologies, I think the cultural integration as well will become something that will follow before the politicians get it together. Yeah.
Okay, one last thing.
All right.
So if you were advising Duma Boko, the president of Botswana,
Yes.
on what its emphasis should be, how it should pursue its objectives best,
Yes.
what kind of focus would you recommend? Region, SADC, the Southern African region playing that? Looking more beyond, where would you put your emphasis?
Yes. I think I would have a tiered approach to that, right? I think regionally, Botswana has one of the highest or most highly educated populations, right? So one of the legacies of the foundational government is free college education for Botswana students. And that created a wave of individuals who were able to go to college and get these different technical expertise. So the first step is, how do we facilitate development within the region? By lending technical expertise, right? One of the biggest points of contention in Botswana is that most of the Southern African countries, I'll specify Mauritius, for instance, don't develop their policy infrastructure. They just come to Botswana and get the documents and go implement it, right? So there's a lot of great work that's being done ideatively around how we think regionally about these things, but we have to think about how to apply and implement those regionally. And then continentally, one of the things Botswana has been great at positioning itself with is this idea of diplomacy, like a good tradition around diplomacy and peacemaking in different ways. And so regionally, what I would advise them to do is to say, hey, we need to think about peacemaking, not only just from a political perspective, but understanding that economics, at least the economics of the day-to-day for people, are an integral part of peacemaking. And so how does Botswana situate itself in that discourse, both in framing what peacemaking could look like in certain parts of Africa, but also economically how Botswana can lend its expertise to help build that infrastructure and build those systems. Yes, thanks. You're welcome. Last call on questions. Yes, Dr. Maviva.
So I have a few notes, many of which that I'll share with you after the fact here there, but I think this is good work. I do, one of my big fascinations is, as you very well know from the work that we've done, surrounds definitions and descriptions of things. So I just want to, so the first part, is sort of like a general comment, and the second part may be something that you can speak to. But as I give both comments, I want to emphasize that we can talk about multiple interests, we can talk about multiple entities with agency and multiple poles, but those are all different things. They're not interchangeable.
Absolutely.
And the reason I bring that up is, so the first comment I wanted to make was about BRICS. And if you could humor me and go to your slide where you had the BRICS with the timeline sort of thing. And again, this is more of a comment, and I think I kind of know what you meant, but I also just want to make sure that when we talk about these things, we are being very clear.
Yeah.
Because we'll go back one more to when you talk about when you're talking about the eras and you're describing.
So that's
Okay, yeah, this one here, right? Because two things that I want to talk about with that I want to quick mention with BRICS is one, from a nomenclature perspective, that cannot be the post-BRICS era. That's actually its heyday. So you have to name that 2011 to something else. The other thing is, I thought the way you, and maybe you were just like, riffing, I thought your categorization of BRICS as a sort of reimagined thing that came in the place of the Soviet Union to be, unless we're just saying that because it's got Russia and it's a counterpoint to US hegemony, I don't think the BRICS is like anything like the Soviet Union at all. You know what I mean? Like in terms of what it is. Some hyper-capitalist, democracies as part of its founding members, right?
Yeah, no, I either misspoke or maybe like it didn't come across.
Oh, sorry.
But I wasn't trying to posit BRICS as a replacement. So I was saying Russia replacing the Soviet Union. I think that's what I said.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's how it Okay.
Yeah. So I was saying like when the Soviet Union is replaced by Russia, so not by BRICS.
Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So that part is good.
Yeah.
Then just the BRICS sort of So there's that. But then the second thing now is about the polls. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of very useful interventions you're making there. But I think like if we can disaggregate between things that are operating from a position of different interests, from a point of different agency, and what the actual polls are. Because you could still be working within your particular interests, but the pole you represent is still the same, you know what I mean? So,
absolutely.
For example, I'm thinking about that in terms of, we were talking about Kenya and Kenya in Haiti. Kenya is in Haiti because the US doesn't want to be there. And they've got incentives that they can dangle on Kenya to say, hey, can you go do this thing in Haiti?
Yeah.
Kenya is not there they're not going to set up a new government for Haiti. They're like a peacekeeping kind of thing, and a severely under-equipped one at that. So to the extent that represents like, we can say like, it may represent Kenya gaining trust in the, to handle things like this. Mm-hmm. But to say that represents anything in terms of Kenya's rise as an influence, things like that. And I was even taking it back to the transatlantic slave trade to say like, sure, there were these uprisings that led to folks getting independence, or getting, emancipation. But to the extent that represents the rising of a pole, you know what I mean? I think we're going to talk about it maybe the chipping away of one. Mm-hmm. Okay. But to say that represents the moving away from this pole, the grandeur of poles, I think is, because we have two poles, right, which are like essentially where the power gravitates, right? We say south, and we say north, and we say this and that. And I think some of those things, I wonder if we can argue that they represent a pole as opposed to just being icon voice.
Yeah. So I'd say it's not necessarily that they represent a pole, but these are things that are happening within that contestation of poles. So at least that's the point that I was making, right? That again, when the Danish are emancipating people, right? Again, this is within their domain, right? When the French are emancipating people, right? This is within their domain. When the Brits, when the Americans, right? So that part of these processes of emancipation, right? Or part of this, or at least maybe tied to Kenya, right? Kenya is also not just passively going there, right? Like they're also queuing to say, hey, within the AU, this gives us some sort of leverage. Within the continent, this gives us certain leverage, right? To lead a peacekeeping force in this way, right? Also couched within the fact that Haiti had applied at one point to be part of the AU, right? So that Kenya is also acting within the space of understanding what that opportunity represents over and above the fact that the United States doesn't want to be there, right? And also the domestic issues that were happening in Kenya at the time, right? Because Kenya was having an uprising, and that in many ways was Kenya's way of trying to shift attention from that. So within the context of polls, right, is that at least these activities are happening within the reorientation, not that they themselves represent the polar ends of the orientation, but that these are happening and shaping how these polls remain not only salient or maybe persist in that capacity. I hope that clears it up.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Any more questions? If not, thank you so much for gracing me with your time and your energy and attention.
Thank you.